before either occipital lobe processed any information from the flashing lights, let's say. If, however, and this is what my opponent would say, if we, however, we take Rip's temporal self-ascriptions to be ascriptions of temporal predicates and relations to neural processes, then we seem forced to say that he is grossly mistaken, not only in that he is mistakenly taking the subjective sequence and objective sequence to be aligned. This was last time a misalignment of two sequences, even though he got the sequences individually right. But also in this case, he mistakenly takes it that there's a well-defined subjective sequence at all. There is no well-defined subjective sequence on this view. The left and right auditory cortices were not only doing their processing at different times, their operations were staggered with respect to the left and right occipital lobes, which do the visual processing. The question whether the bark was neurally registered before or after the blue flash was neurally registered is simply not a well-posed question. So here is the timeline. This is the objective events. So in 2006, the right auditory cortices registered a bark noise. In 2100, the left occipital lobe registered the right visual field information, and so forth. In the year 3005 seconds, the light bulb flashed blue. In 3006 seconds, it flashed red. And in the 3007 seconds, there was a bark noise. So those are all objective facts, nothing subjective there. If you're a Kantian, this is what you think is the subjective timeline. You think that in 3005 seconds, Rip saw the blue flash. That was Rip's mental, psychological state. In 3006 seconds, Rip saw the red flash. In 3007 seconds, Rip hears the bark. I say bark hears bark. That's a typo. Sorry about that. But if you're a Cartesian, the subjective timeline, if that's neural, if you're a Cartesian materialist, it's just ill-defined. There is no answer to what that timeline is. Sort of, maybe. I'm going to get to a possible objection at the end of the paper, which is coming right up. Okay. I want to examine briefly what was happening in the lab during the soliloquy. Remember, the soliloquy was this. Soliloquy was the bout of contemplation, including the attempts to think himself out of the lounge and into the vat, which occurred in the lounge after the light bulb flashed, but before the door was opened. Okay? I said I would refer back to this. Here's some reflections on that. 2, well, there was no brain anywhere at the time of that soliloquy, in the lounge or elsewhere. In fact, Rip's brain had been completely dead for over 100 years, some of its parts for much longer than 100 years, during his inner thought dialogue. His brain had been dead, long dead. Here's another interesting thing. There was nothing relevant happening on the hard drives, either the sensory or the motor hard drives. There were just a few signals regulating breathing on the motor hard drive. The sensory one, there were maybe just a few signals about heart rate and such. Now, of course, had Rip been talking to himself, there still wouldn't have been a brain, but at least there'd be things happening in the data streams in the hard drive. The motor drives would be sending signals to his vocal apparatus, controlling his breathing. The sensors would be streaming data to the sensory hard drives about the sound of his voice, and so forth. But he was thinking silently. None of this was happening. I have to admit that this scenario does quite a bit to test my Kantian faith, the idea that someone could be sitting around thinking about something, even though their brain's long dead, and nothing else is occurring. There's nothing anywhere in the physical universe at that time that even suggests itself as a possible material substrate for that thought. To summarize, a subject could be engaging in thought at time t and location L, even though there's quite literally nothing happening, nothing physical happening anywhere in the universe nor has there been for many years, that could possibly be the material infrastructure of that thinking. And in fact, there isn't even any suitably ordered set of physical states that have ever occurred or ever will that will correspond to the temporal features of that soliloquy. This is a suggestion that has significant shock value, at least to me. Now, some might take this to be a reductio of the Kantian position, but it will have this effect only to one who has some residual Cartesian intuitions. And I must confess that the shock value that tests my Kantian faith is a result of the fact that I too have some occasional impure Cartesian thoughts. The Cartesian intuition makes one want there to be something that one can point to as the subject. For the Cartesian materialist, that thing is the brain. Okay. My big thought experiment here of Rip is developed exactly to remove this thing from the scene altogether, first from the vicinity, then from the time, and then finally from any well-defined time. In short, trying to turn the brain into as much of a Kantian transcendental ego as one can, while remaining within a broadly materialist framework. Rip, by the way, was eventually told about Project C. This forced him out of his comfortable fallback belief that he was a brain in a vat in 2006. There was now nothing anywhere in the universe that seemed to correspond to his nice, coherent, unified mental life. Rip found the situation even more unsettling than I do. I've summarized Rip's doxastic situation in the next slide here. Okay, final section, where I'm going to discuss some objections. And I've got 5 objections I'm going to discuss, comments/objections. I'm going to put them in 2 groups. So first, the group A, and these are objections to the thought experiment. Group B are going to be objections that don't worry about the thought experiment, but worry about the conclusions drawn from it. So the group A ones first. Objection 1. The timing required for sensory motor engagement is inconsistent with the temporal displacement of the body and the brain. My response to that is usually yes, that's correct, but that's exactly what the time travel, the sending data back in time solves. Normally, if the brain was earlier than the body, you would have a bad feedback loop, but that's exactly why you need the time travel here. Trust me, it actually works if you sort of think this through consistently. If data can be sent back in time, well, let me put it this way. If the Dennett-style neural signal splicing is possible and information can be sent back in time, then the thought experiment, as I described it, could be executed given appropriate technology. So trust me on that. It would take a long time to try to demonstrate that if someone didn't believe it, but if you work it out and think it through, you'll see that that's right. Okay. Well, this leads to what the next 2 objections are. I just said that if you believe in the original Dennett thought experiment and you can send signals back in time, then my thought experiment works. The next 2 objections are just objecting about these 2 parts of the antecedent. So objection 2. Look, maintaining neural signals between the body and brain or between the brain parts is insufficient for maintaining adequate brain function. So even the original Dennett scenario is technologically implausible or something like that. Number of responses here. Yeah, it could. I've sort of made things simple by just talking about sensory inputs and motor outputs. But think of those as just placeholders for any relevant causal contact of any sort between the brain and body or brain parts, and maybe more than just electrical signals mediated by axons is important. So maybe nitrous oxide concentration levels is important. Maybe peptide concentrations are important. If it turns out those things are important, then just tweak the thought experiment so that there's a sensor by brain part A that doesn't only transmit the signals but detects what the concentration of nitrous oxide is at that interface. And that information is transmitted to brain part B, and technology replicates exactly that nitrous